Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Lucy Handley, Adult Programs Coordinator at the Ridgefield Library. And tonight we have Dr. Mark Schenker, who is the Senior Associate Dean Emeritus. Hold on, I got to let someone in. At Yale College. Here with the final lecture in the series on AI and literature. And this one is a really good one. Welcome, Dr. Schenker.
Thanks very much. And I'd like to say, as I emphasized last time to a smaller group, I hope these will be lecture discussions. My hope is that these will be modeled on what I do in book groups, which is I have a lot to say, but I hope that the readers have something to say too. For one thing, I don't learn anything from what I have to say, but I do learn from what readers have to say. What's more is, and this is sort of my mantra through all my decades of teaching, if you want to be a more sensitive reader of fiction, spend more time with other readers. It's not enough just to read good books, because you'll never see a book other than the way you see it. But having even brief and casual conversation with other readers can be very illuminating. In addition to which, it just makes for a more interesting evening if you hear more than one voice. But I do have some things to say. So I forecast last time that I saved this book for last, not just because it's the most recent, it's only a couple years old, and not just because it's by the most preeminent of our three writers, not to take anything away from Ian McEwan, but Kazuo Ishiguro has won the Nobel Prize in Literature back in 2017, and he's been a very, very productive Japanese-born British citizen. He took British citizenship in 1983, and many of his books reflect a kind of British awareness of class, which is generally not true of American novels. So he came to extraordinary fame. It wasn't his first novel, with Remains of the Day. The book was published in 1989, the movie a few years later. I believe that they're both masterpieces. They are my favorite. It is my favorite of his novels. I think also it's the best of his novels. And it has something in common with this book, which I'll talk about later. And then closer to home in terms of future and dystopia and technology was the book he published in 2005, Never Let Me Go, also made into a movie 5 years later. And in that novel, if you don't know it, there's going to be a spoiler, but it's been out for a while. Children are cloned, or people are cloned, and bred as organ donors so that they can supply spare parts to the favored class. And when they no longer have any more organs to give, they are said to be not finished, which we would understand as dead, but completed, which does mean dead, but completed makes it sound like they've fulfilled their mission, which of course is what it's about. Moreover, they're kept in the dark about this by a class of guardians, one of whom lets them in on the secret and is dismissed. And then a group of these clones finds out the secret and tries to escape their fate. That's Never Let Me Go. One of the women who's central there is a carer, C-A-R-E-R. That is, it's her job to take care of these organ donors who don't know what their mission is. And what I'll say about Remains of the Day, which I could talk about endlessly, is that Stevens, who is not only the focus of the novel, but the narrator in the same way that Klara is here, is someone who is not an artificial friend, but there's a lot of artifice in him. He has been denatured by the class system, by his being a man's man, by the British culture that servants, especially the main butler of a house, should be ready to appear at any moment, but otherwise seem invisible. And everything about their human interactions with the staff and certainly with the employer are under an artificial arrangement. You could call Stevens and the people of his profession artificial people, and you wouldn't be missing the point. What's more, like Klara, Stevens was bred to serve. Klara is a servant class. She's there to be a companion to Josie. And the most remarkable and demoralizing thing that happens in the dystopian future of Klara and the Sun is that children are lifted, that is to say, debased as human beings, but lifted in terms of academic ability. And it may be what's killing some of them. It also means that they're so intent on doing well and getting into good schools, and you see how that's not a great exaggeration from people we know. I'm not asking for a list of names, but you know what I'm talking about. That there's harm being done to the children to improve them. And because they are so overscheduled in efforts to have tutors, they don't have playmates. And so friends have to be bred to keep them company. That's the most innovative thing, this notion that parents are genetically fixing. What's more, in the novel, we then find out that there's a plan to make sure that if Josie's illness overcomes her, she will be replaced by Klara, who is not only human-like, but is being bred to imitate and fulfill the role of Josie Arthur. So a pretty heady and I think very original dystopian vision. Going back to Remains of the Day, Stevens discovered late in his life that he's had a chance to enjoy a fuller life, especially with a woman who was also in the household. She offered that friendship and maybe more, and he rejected it passively. And at the end, when he comes close to realizing again, he has a kind of negative epiphany. He has a sort of insight into what he really needs to learn. He says is banter. He needs to learn small talk because that's the oil that runs society. He is what James Joyce would call a painful case. He has no insight, even though he's an intelligent human being. Klara is barred from having much insight because she's an artificial friend. And although she is very bright and capable of learning and very attentive to small details, she is at a disadvantage by being in the dark, I'm punning purposely, about the role of the sun. And because she has a child or a foreigner, an immigrant's notion of the way culture works, despite her intelligence about reading human beings. But that being a servant mentality means she is ultimately disposable. And even though she's not being bred for parts that can be organs to other people, the painter is planning to use her wholesale to take Josie's part. It's like families that have savior siblings that have more than one child in case one of the child dies, or the recent memoir of the English prince that he's the spare. If something should happen, they have a backup. And there are families that do have that kind of calculus of we'll have an additional child as a kind of safety net. So that the novel is narrated in the first person, the way that Remains of the Day is narrated, means that everything we read in the book comes from Klara, both her naivete and her insights. And the note is struck in the very first line when it says about her companion, all right, when we were new, Rosa and I were in mid-store. So I think it's a rare person who picked up this book when it was published and didn't know the basic premise. But if you didn't, not when we were young, when we were new, and it immediately goes to the store where she's on display. And 6 parts later, in some hundreds of pages, she's not on display. It's the opposite of display. She's kind of on a junk pile, and she has a very important meeting with the manager. So I'll set that up as a general premise, and I'll say before I invite comment, and let me say, if you're willing to be visible, even though you're recorded, It makes me feel better that I'm looking at people instead of names. But you do what you want, and I'll manage. So when you talk about artificial intelligence, and that phrase now has exploded because it's here. Artificial intelligence doesn't suggest anything relational. It's out there, artificial intelligence, like a typewriter or an automobile or any other kind of thing. But when you talk about an artificial friend, you cross a real line in that you're not only talking about an artificial person, which we generally don't talk about. We have words for those, whether it's a droid or a robot. But when you talk about an artificial friend, you're not only talking about something radically different from intelligence or technology, you're talking about a relationship. And for many people, the most intimate relationship, or one of the most intimate relationships you can have. It doesn't matter that some of these parents are buying these friends to keep their children busy or occupied or to keep them from getting lonely. This book's theme is loneliness. Loneliness is at the heart of this book. Loneliness is at the heart of Remains of the Day. It's not just that you're being bred to be a friend, but you're being bred to offset what's missing in this person's life because of their parents structuring their futures. So there's a lot of tampering with what it means to be human. And I'm not the only reader of the book who thinks that Klara, in some senses, shows more understanding of humanity than the human beings. I think that's a given. So I'll stop there for a moment. We're coming up on the first quarter hour, and say whether you read the book when it first came out, or read it for the first time recently, or reread it, I wonder if anyone would like to say something about the book in any context, whether it's our context of artificial intelligence or anything otherwise, to get some voices other than mine in the mix.
Dr. Schenker.
Call me Mark.
Oh, hi, Mark. First, I wanted to thank you for introducing me to this book that I may not have come across on my own. And
this is Maria, right? That's
yes,
talking.
this is
Okay.
Maria, yes. And I just wanted to say that I found the novel excellent. The imagery, the symbolism, the portrayal of the human, in quotes, heart, ironically rendered through a non-human entity. And if you'll indulge me, I wrote some notes after I read the book, and I'll just briefly read them.
Maria, anybody with a name that begins with MAR is aces with me. And you should know that on my screen, you're next to Mary Kay and Marge. So I don't know if you belong to some club, but you're all welcome.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, Maria. Speak as much as
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I'm going to read just a couple of notes that I have. The first being the thread of the topic of loneliness entwines itself throughout the novel. She always notices loneliness and is so sensitive to it in others. It is gratifying that, in the end, she's not lonely in the yard, although she is by herself. She doesn't even want to be relocated with the other AFs because she has her memories to keep her company. I thought that was very gratifying. And then in relation to the son, I had written that Klara was in essence praying, whether it's to the sun or to God or to the universe. It was a prayer, a beseechment that also involved self-sacrifice, which, shades of Christ. Her innocence of heart is beautifully rendered by the author. I suppose the reading audience would be somewhat divided if asked, what was it just a coincidence that Josie was healed on that stormy morning? Or, as assessed by Klara, was there really a greater power at work? If we are biological machines of a sort, are our prayers being heard? That was just a note I had. And
well, thank you. Let me make.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I'm not sure you have a lot of competition, but we'll see. Let me say that one thing that I think is striking about the book, and I have very high regard for Ishiguro. I think this is a very inventive and nuanced way to talk about a dystopia, much more insightful about what it might be that we do with non-humans. You know, the whole idea of technology is to make our lives easier. But in the conventional sense of, you know, making an automobile or a typewriter or a computer to make life easier, no one's thinking that we're redefining what it means to have a life. I think it is a brilliant touch that Klara is so technologically sophisticated, but she has the most primitive of beliefs, what we believe most societies have as their first religion. They worship the sun, and why not? We know that from early art, that is illustrations, early poems and prayers, um, literature began as prayers for crops. We know this from records that the first kind of art was praying for an intervention, praying to the elements generally, but the sun first and foremost. And why not? The sun is the origin of life, and many primitive societies, and by primitive, I don't mean stupid, I mean just not technological, not sophisticated in terms of engineering or even basic tools, begins with the notion that the sun, which keeps us warm, the sun, which lets us see our surroundings many hours every day, the sun, which seems essentially always good. You know, wind and rain can be good and they can be bad. Yes, the sun can be very hot, but it's easy enough, even in primitive society, to protect yourself from the sun. But the sun doesn't make tidal waves and earthquakes and all of that. That she would think the sun, in her ignorance, was a god, that she would pray to it, that she would think the sun woke up, resurrected the sleeping man, and so on. Perfect sense of a childlike understanding. The last thing that I'll say is the people who are being benefited, who are the consumers of this product, are not people like Rick and his family who are poor. It's the well-to-do. And well before there was any suggestion of artificial friends in the way this novel talks about, wealthy people hired artificial friends for their children. Sometimes they were servants. It was a very common thing that if servants had children around the age of the employer's children, those children were brought in to be companions to the child. If the servants of the manor did not have children, sometimes a lower level maid, always a female, was employed explicitly or implicitly to be a kind of companion and sometimes a playmate to the child. So there's a kind of non-technological component to that. Would anyone else like to weigh in, however you spell your first name? You can just speak up, and if more than one person talks at a time, we'll sort it out.
I did have one thing, talking about all the themes and
This is Mary, right?
yeah, Mary Kay. Hi everybody. Thanks so much for your presentation. Appreciate it. So yeah, I read it, and one thing that I was confused about was when she would say that she would see things in boxes. There was the boxes effect that was described, and there was also when they were in front of the theater and people were stick figures and then more detailed and less detailed, and this sort of, I don't know, it felt like a computer glitch or something going on. I didn't know what to make of it, and maybe you can tell me your thoughts.
Well, I'm hoping that other people will tell you their thoughts. I want to say that that's part of the idea of a book group. Also, it's clear to me that nobody writes a novel like this expecting that it won't be talked about in social terms, right? So you can read A Closed and Common Orbit, although I think not many people did. That was our least populated session, the sci-fi one. But no author writes a novel like this and just wants it to be a story self-contained. He's engaging, as many great writers do, with large philosophical and sociological questions about the future about the present, about humanity, about parenting, about childhood. So would anyone like to comment or better answer the question that Mary's raising?
I'm not sure, but was that when the father took some of the oil out of her that was, making her work? Were we at the part, was she asking about that at that part? Because I
No,
think we were at the theater.
yeah, it was before that.
That was before that?
Yeah, but although let me say that I do think it's worth pointing out that her essence, right, a kind of her blood, is partly sacrificed for what's happening. So I appreciate, this is the sisterhood of MARs, Maria chiming in, but Mary rightly points out that she has those errors earlier. Anyone want to venture a guess? That's, the worst can happen is you're wrong, about what we're to make of that? So I'll say, in the interest of time, and I don't have a teacher's manual to the book, but I think we're supposed to understand. And is it not true, Mary, that's relatively early? I can't hear you.
Yeah, no, I was on mute. I think even when she was in the storefront, she would have these compartmentalized visions with
Yeah.
a head in this box and eyeballs in that box, and they'd overlap and they'd.
So I want to say that the compartmentalization, I think, is part of the way that she's been engineered. One of the first things that child psychologists tell us is that infants, toddlers, young children, the first thing they learn is, this is me and this is not me, capital N, capital E. So a child who sucks on her toes does not know that she's sucking on her toes. She'll suck on anything you put near her, and her toes are nearby. And that as part of their psychosocial sexual development, they understand that this is my foot and that's your foot. This is me and this is a bookshelf. This is the man I call daddy, and those are other men that I might call daddy, but they're not my daddy. So one of the things children are doing naturally, that is actual children, not artificial children, is they're compartmentalizing, and they're doing it in a way that's not as noticeable. One of the things that computers do, they have to do things more explicitly when we think about them, because it's not yet natural. I took the mistake just to mean that she learns as she goes and she's not perfect. And why is it that very bright children every now and again will write a C backwards, even though they know how to write a C? But it may be there's something more subtle than that. So Elizabeth, were you, I'm just reading your face. Were you looking to say something?
Yeah, so I was looking to say something sort of very.
I want to say that I'm very like Klara, is I can really read human emotions on the face. I think that's what most people are hiding from me. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
This is very different, and a very different kind of comment, and very stripped from all of the sci-fi piece of this. But when I got to the end of the story, and even partway through, to me, it seemed like a version of the Velveteen Rabbit story. And I kept asking myself, what was it that made Klara real? Was it her sophisticated animation, or was it because of the caring and loving relationship? Because it was the love that made the Velveteen Rabbit real. It was because his eye got rubbed off and his nose got, frayed and everything else. And Klara ended up in the junkyard, and the Velveteen Rabbit ended up, for anybody that remembers that story, a shabby toy, but well loved and well used. we have always, as humans, we have had a tradition of growing up with beloved toys. And we have toys, we have pets, and we have friends. And, you know, Klara on the spectrum, you know, we've talked about her as an artificial friend, but I have to say, when I got to the end and the scene in the junkyard and her sitting there, it reminded me a lot of the Velveteen Rabbit. And I thought, what is it to me? It brought up a lot of questions, and not the least of which is, what is this thing we call life? What is the difference between the Velveteen Rabbit or a beloved pet? Or you also brought up ideas I hadn't thought about, were these real live sort of artificial or created companions in the form of servants. What are these things that we humans form relationships with? We have a fundamental need to create relationships with other entities. And what makes those entities special?
Yeah, thank you very much for that extended comment. So I do think it's important to bring pets into the mix. I think it's important to bring toys that are in the shape of living things, whether dolls that look like humans or pets or other kinds of animals. Remarkable how I have now 3 grandchildren. The oldest is 4. She had to go to the doctor today. She had her little dinosaur, green stuffed dinosaur, Wego, with her the entire time. It originates not in that thing, not in the pet, but in the need of the person who wants this companion. And the novel is very much a incisive look at what it is about people needing people so badly that even non-people will fulfill it. Here, she's bought for a child who is impaired and may be dying, but the girl treats it as if she's coming from a pet store, and perfectly reasonable that she would do that. When she's in the sort of junk heap and asked not to be moved, she has 2 insights. One of them is old, she knew it before, and that is that love is not in people, it's in the relationship between people. It's relational, and that's something she's come to understand. And in some ways, that's kind of the moral of the novel. If that were the only thing the novel had to offer, it would be a kind of anticlimactic or not particularly insightful. It gets to that through this remarkable creation of Klara, the inventive situation of the dystopia and the relations between people. And then at the end, as she watches the manager walk away, and walk away is repeated as a phrase, she notices that she's listing. And Klara, in her ignorance, wants her not to list because part of her coat will trail. She doesn't have any understanding that the manager is wearing out, that the manager is older than she was, is either aging or has had an accident or something's impairing her. And Klara registers to us that she's walking away in a different way that she walked around in the store. And I want to read this to you because this is Ishiguro's brilliance. Goodbye, manager, thank you. She reached down to the metal crate she'd been sitting on and dragged it back to its original position, making the same unpleasant noise. The manager keeps things straight. One of the things I learned when I was a kid is put things back where you found them. She then walked away down the long passage between the rows, and it was noticeable how she walked differently to the way she had in the store. This is Klara through and through. With each second step, she would lean to her left in a way that made me worry her long coat on that side might touch the dirty ground. When she was mid-distance, she stopped and turned, and I thought she might look back one last time at me. There's a meme from many books, many movies, right? Someone important to you still or previously walks away down a vista, and the question is, do they turn around and look one last time? But she was gazing at the far distance in the direction of the construction crane on the horizon. Then she continued to walk away. So I had told my undergraduates that once they've read a book, and I hope they have, that they could do a very good synopsis by reading the first and last paragraph of every chapter, if they've read the book, because then it makes sense. The last image here and the last word of this chapter is a human being walking away. It may be a comment on the fact that humanity is on its way out. It may be that the manager has nothing more to do in this polar opposite from a well-run store, this sort of junk heap. It is telling that we understand that the manager is suffering from infirmity or aging, and that Klara, OCD Klara, I mean, she's wired that way, she was born that way, so to speak, is just thinking about her not getting her coat dirty. That to me is the glory of this book, the inventiveness of the sensitivity of this artificial friend. But I want to say, I second everything that Elizabeth said about how we invest pets and humanoid or pet-like dolls into our relationship of love and anti-loneliness. A child could have a favorite thing that's a thing, could have a favorite rag or blanket, security blanket that they associate with their bed often. But it's rare for a child to have a thing that rises to the level of the love they would have for a doll or a pet animal, let alone a pet. And I think it's worth thinking about, why is it that when we think about a future, we think about technology serving the needs of the person who owns it? The relationship is between the owner and the servant thing, this artificial friend. Other comments about Klara and the sun? Does anyone want to say anything about it in relation to either the other books we've read or the topic generally? This is the last of 3. You've got another 20-something minutes, and then I'll be gone. I'll walk away with the manager. Is there anything anyone wants to add about the book in any way? I want to say I appreciate that people come thinking that I have wisdom to share, and I hope I do have some. But I want to say again that the value of a book group is, again, not in any one person, but in the transaction between people. If love is not in Josie or Klara, but in their relationship, insight into literature is not in me or you, but in the talking back and forth. And, you know, my undergraduates, I no longer teach undergraduates, but undergraduates are suspicious when I say that I can learn from them, because they've had a lifetime, that is their academic lifetime of 16 or 17 years, of believing that the teacher wants things her way or his way, and they have to figure it out so they get the right answer. I try to encourage my students when I have them, and it wouldn't be every class, but it would certainly be every course someone would ask something or say something that I had never thought of. So does anyone want to add a comment or a question in the communal endeavor of having a book group?
Mark, if I may, I will comment on the fact that the portrayal of how we're loved by others reminded me of the quote from The Wizard of Oz, a heart is not judged by how much you love, by how much you're loved by others. And I was wondering what other people thought of the quote from the book early on in the book, which I think may have reflected this, when the manager tells Klara it's for the customers to choose the AF, never the other way around. Because I thought that that was, when I read that sentence, I thought that that was very telling of what the author was trying to portray in many ways here. I'd just like to know what other people think of that comment.
I would too, but don't hold your breath, Maria. I think we have a lot of listeners. So if anyone wants to jump in, do. I'm not scolding you. I want to say that one thing that's interesting about the book, and I'm giving comments in the absence of other comments. Maria, I appreciate your keeping at it. It's one thing to hire, to buy someone or something that's going to keep your child occupied and not be lonely. And of course, in this advanced dystopian society, this thing is another little girl. We're back to Machines Like Me, where they've mastered the art of making false people. But it's a very different thing to have a companion and to then have someone who you love and loves you, especially if what's happening with Klara, whether this was part of her design, is she's learning about humanity as she goes. One of the things about servant classes, and there are servant classes in a lot of literature, usually human beings in a social class, but there are lots of people in novels, as there are in life, whose job it is to serve a higher other class. There's a class differential in this book that's fulfilled by Rick's family, is that the serving class has to know who they're serving. The people who are being served don't need to know they're servants. And that differential, that majority culture is largely ignorant of minority culture, especially in a society like India during the Raj, during the English imperialist period. The English didn't have to know the Indians. They didn't matter. But the Indians had to know how the British were working for their advancement and sometimes for their survival. The same thing's true of Black people in Jim Crow America, who had to know who their oppressors were in order to survive, sometimes literally survive, when the oppressing class didn't have to know anything about the people, and often didn't, that they were subjugating. And that's true sometimes in societies where males are dominant and women are not, whatever the numbers, that men can be largely ignorant, and not just in America, of what women are like and how they function as human beings. I don't mean as machines. Where the reverse is that often women in American society and elsewhere have to be very attuned to how men operate because they have the power. And I do think that there's a difference between getting an artificial friend who's going to keep you company and an artificial friend who winds up learning about humanity from you. As always, there are consequences in technology that are not in the original design. Let me ask a very narrow and specific question, and maybe I will encourage some of you who want to speak. Again, no obligation. Why, of the many things this book could be called, is it called Klara and the Sun? I don't have the answer to that. Again, I get the same novel the rest of you do. I just have to think about it. But I think it's a fair question to ask, why, of the many titles that this book could have, is it called Klara and the Sun? Okay, I'm going to try another tack. Maybe it's a good thing that this is the last of three. I can't be the only person in this room who's had the experience of knowing someone, maybe someone you know well, maybe someone you love, often an older member of your family, who has been raised to be very prejudicial about a kind of person, you fill in the blank. And your grandma never had any respect for people of color or Jews or immigrants or Irish or fill in the blank. And then they become needy, and the family has to hire a visiting nurse And maybe she's West Indian, which is often the case in my experience living in New York City and now Connecticut. And all of a sudden, a woman who you know, even though you love your grandmother, is scornful of West Indians, of people of color, of people from the islands, of people with an accent. This West Indian nurse becomes a member of the family, not just from your point of view as a loving granddaughter or grandson, but from grandma's point of view. This woman now is someone she loves, but she doesn't love her as a West Indian. She loves her as Maria or Teresa or whatever she might be, almost always a woman. And in spite of her prejudice, she loves this person because she's accepted them as a human being. How many people have had the experience, it can't just be me, of having members of your family who are dismissive or worse of people who are homosexual or transgender, and then a person in that category falls in love with someone in your family or cohabitates or now marries that person, and they're accepted, let's hope. And now this accepted fill in the blank, transgender, bisexual, homosexual person is okay, not because they're what they are, but because they're who they are. And in an ideal world, who they are and what they are become joined, and someone learns something about the category that they used to think of as a non-person, because that's what it comes down to. They're not just lower on the echelon. The oppressors of Blacks thought of them as non-people, and people who exclude certain categories of gender think of them as not people. I do think that's something else that's operating in the book and operating in our prejudices, that you get to know a category of persons only often because you meet someone who you recognize as a human being. It's not easy for some people to recognize what it means to be human. I think it was Terence who said, "I am a human being. Nothing human is alien to me." That is to say, I know a human being when I see one. And I'm sorry to say, and here I'll be a little bit philosophical and sociological, I think that many people don't know a human being when they see one, and that the artificial intelligence is not in the machine or the clone, it's in the person whose intelligence is artificially constrained by saying this person doesn't check all the boxes of what I think a human being should be. You know, we're at a point now in society, I'm not preaching, I think this is fair to say, where there are going to be more challenges to what it is to be a human being, and recognizing, is someone on life support, is someone who is a gender you never even imagined, is someone who has attributes that you find hard to think of as human, a human being. You know, what is the old thing that Bigot would say? You're going to marry another man? What next? We're going to marry animals? We're going to marry giraffes? They make that leap out of humanity to make the ludicrous case, the reducing it to the absurd. We're going to allow anything to happen? No, we're going to allow the range of humanity to happen. And it is broader than your narrow-mindedness is aware of. And so I do think we face a challenge of the artificial intelligence, the infirm intelligence of many human beings. Well, I've said plenty. Anyone want to add anything to the mix?
Well, one thing I would say is that I think that the humans in this book, I found to be a little bit more likable in that regard.
Wait, I'm sorry. What's more likable?
The humans in Klara and the son, they were still human. They still had their foibles. They still had their prejudices, but they seemed able to be a little bit more fluid and flexible and have some kindnesses than in the Ian McEwan book.
Yeah, when you say they, you mean both the humans and Klara?
No, mostly the humans. I mean, Klara was a much warmer
I just want to understand the
personality.
they. Yes.
Yeah, Klara was much warmer than Adam. But just if we look just at humanity, since you were commenting on humanity itself, I think that this author has a much more, he's got a softer, more forgiving view of humanity than Ian McKellen did.
Elizabeth, we should remember that the companions to the artificial friends are children, and children are typically much more welcoming of a range of what it means to be a human being. Children often teach the adults, and even Josie's mother comes around when she scolds the artist and says multiple times that Klara deserves better, and she starts as a not wholly positive character. I do think that the simplicity of children often leads the way, and many movies and books, sometimes well done, sometimes very cheesily, make the point in To Kill a Mockingbird, the outcast who is the man who is mentally impaired, Boo Radley, is hiding behind the door after in Atticus's home after he has saved Scout from what might have been death or worse. And it's the child who says, "You can come out, Boo." She has no fear of him when he's been castigated by the entire town. And that's very moving, but not unrealistic. It's filled with sentiment, but it's not just sentimentality. And I do think we need to remember that although there's this leap forward between part 5 and part 6, when Josie is now going off to college, for most of the novel, these are children. Yeah. I want to say also that we shouldn't lose the depth of humanity in that Chrissy is dealing with a child who might die. And whatever one thinks about replacing her, this is a horrible thing to contemplate. And, you know, children are always dying. We're in a moment right now, whether between gun violence, wholesale gun violence, or the horror in the Middle East, we know that many, many children are dying needlessly. And it is so heartbreaking, even if you're not a parent or a grandparent. And, you know, you have to cut people a lot of slack if they're facing the knowledge, as many, many people do as soon as their child is born, that this child is was born under a death notice. And so I do think the novel is remarkable in keeping a lot of the poignancy of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a mother or father, what it means to be somebody who is grappling with a brave new world that has such people in it, to quote the line from The Tempest that we saw invoked in Machines Like Me.
Mark, on your point of the poignancy of what it is to be human, and especially that the author is using this, as I said, you know, from a non-human entity, the part of the book where they're thinking about having Klara become, in case Josie dies, that she's going to be, you know, taking over. And the one thing that she was worried about that she couldn't replicate was her heart, that she was worried about if she could study it enough, if she could learn it enough, if she could become Josie, because there was that certain something that was so elusive to each person, that part of the human heart. And I thought that being brought out by the author was just such a lovely thing, along with what we were saying earlier.
Maria, may I ask, have you read Remains of the Day?
I have not.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you as a friend, if you'll let me be a friend.
Thank you.
You should read that novel.
I intend to. I wrote it down when you first mentioned.
Beautifully rendered novel, and you will see similarities in this man who is an excellent servant, and his excellence as a servant means he has to curtail his humanity, and that some of you may know that in that class system, in the Downton Abbey real world, and I have given lectures on the real world of Downton Abbey, what that was like when the manor homes were flourishing in the 18th and 19th century. Unless you were the main woman servant or male servant, when you went as a footman or a lower ranked servant to visit with your employer another estate, everybody at the estate you were going to called you by the last name of your employer. So if I had an estate, the Schenker estate, and I decided to visit a friend or colleague and to stay for the week, during that week, my entourage, except for the first male, first female servant, they would just be called Schenker. Anybody in the house would say, Schenker, over here, because they didn't need to bother to know who they were. And even when they were treated very badly, it was a common thing. For example, I'm talking about how the Ishiguro novel fits into this novel by testing the limits and breadth of humanity. One of the conventional things that was done is that they would put an expensive coin, a gold coin, behind a vase in a corner of the drawing room that was to be dusted and cleaned every day. And if the next day it was gone, they had a thief on their hands. And if the next day it was still there, it meant that they didn't clean there because they didn't report the coin. That is, damned if you do and damned if you don't. And they were setting them up for that. When you ask those people who were servants what they thought of their job, they loved their job because they were working for, if they were working for a great house. Their humanity had been constrained, had been morphed into being a servant of that house. And there's something that social psychologists call basking in reflected glory. The anagram is Burge. So lots of people will say in a week that they won the World Series. We won the World Series, whether it's Texas or Arizona or fill in the blank. Well, you didn't have anything to do with it, but you are basking in the reflected glory of your team, of your business, of your something, whatever it might be. And it was very common when those people would be asked about how they felt, that again, if they were in a great house, not necessarily a house that was kind to them, but a house that was noble and famous and a good position to get, they would have that sense that I don't mind the job I'm doing because I'm working for so-and-so, even if they were badly treated. I'll give you an old joke that will make the point. A circus inspector goes into a tent one morning and sees an elderly man shoveling the manure from circus animals. And he says to the guy, how long have you been doing that for? And the guy said, since 5:30 this morning. He said, no, I mean, how long has it been your job? He said, it's coming up on 40 years. And you have other jobs, right? You do other things in the circus? No, all I do is shovel this stuff. He says, you've been doing that for 30 something years. Why don't you get another job? And the guy says, and leave show business? He's happy that he's working in the circus. And that was very much the mentality. So I want to say, I encourage any of you who haven't read Remains of the Day, and again, part of its flavor and strength is it's narrated by the man who isn't aware that he is impaired as he is, and he slowly gets a chance to recognize it, and you'll see what happens at the end. Remains of the Day, the Remains of the Day, refers to the fact that as he gets older, he's thinking, what is there left to his life? And as good as the novel is, and it's very good, the movie with Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson is equally good as a movie. So
Thank you for that recommendation.
Servant class and the idea that in order to serve the people who are higher up than you, or your owners in the case of Klara and the son, the sense is that you lose some of your humanity by definition. So,
may I just make one more comment? You had asked about what we thought the title, why he said Klara and the sun. And you had a wonderful answer. I had a much more simplistic view of it. But when she was in the store early on, and she would want to be placed by the window because the sun virtually, I mean, actually, empowered her and, made her work better, made her work at all. And, later on when it came to be more of a godlike essence, I thought that all tied in with what we just spoke about, with that part of Josie that she couldn't duplicate, that essence of humanity. I thought it was tied in with that because the sun was to her the essence of what gave her her certain something.
Yeah. So let me say in the 4 minutes I have remaining, in the hopes that, again, and I no aspersions on anyone who's not talking, please come back whether you want to talk or be viewed or not. I'll give you this illustration, which if some of you have been in other of my book groups, you've heard before. When my daughter, who is now 41, was maybe 3 or 4 years old, I would often read her stories, classic stories, and most of what I'm about to tell you is true. I was reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and she stopped me at one point and said, "Daddy, why are there 3 bears in the story and not more or less?" And I said, because I'm a loving father and I care about literature and patient. And I said, well, because in the story, it works on the Aristotelian mean of too much, too little, just right. So daddy, mama, baby, too cold, too hot. So, and she said, very good, my man, go on. And I continued to read. And somewhere along the line, she said, and why are they bears? How come they're not other? Why are they bears, Daddy? All of that so far is true, except for what I said. And I said, look, do you want to read a story or not? They're bears, okay? They're just bears. And because I'm an English teacher, more than a loving father, I think, although I am a loving father, I thought about that for a long time. And I realized that if you ask people what associations they make with bears, especially in the last few years as bears have been more a problem in urban and suburban Connecticut, although a bear can kill you, they typically don't. Most people fear from bears that they will break your stuff or eat your food, which is exactly what Goldilocks does in the story. In the story, we all get that the bears are treated like people. Walt Disney made a fortune out of that idea. But we miss the part that Goldilocks is not just a trespasser. She doesn't just act like an animal. She acts like a bear. She breaks their stuff. She breaks the campsite. She steals their food. So instead of having this transformation of the animals into people, isn't that adorable? There's this counter transformation of a little girl acting like an animal. Now you can say, Schenker, I don't believe it. I don't see it. And I'll say, live and be well. But I will tell you, I have told this story for 50 years, and many, many people see that balanced exchange. And the story is better, whatever you think of it, when you see, oh, the bears act like people, and the person acts like a bear. If you say to me, what does it mean? I don't know. I don't care. But the reason I saw it is somebody asked a silly question. How come they're bears? And I know that in my classes, I sometimes have a brave soul who will ask a very simple and even off-the-wall question, maybe like, why is it called this or why that? Why do they live at this address? And somebody invariably will roll their eyes like, can we just move on? Her name's Klara, let's move on. But if it wasn't for the people who asked the unexpected question, the question that you would never ask, we wouldn't learn what we can learn by saying, well, let's think about this for a moment. And that's another advantage of being in a book group, of being in this transactional relationship where you're not just receiving information from me, but exchanging information. So I'll end by thanking all of you for coming. I hope to see you with or without your faces sometime in the future if I'm invited back. I do want to thank Lucy for her generosity in not only having this idea that we should talk about artificial intelligence in the context of literary fiction and not sort of worrying about plagiarism and other things that are important, but not in my field. And I also want to thank her for the generosity of her saying, you can have 3 meetings, you pick the books, tell me what you want to do. We've had partnership of many years now, so I think that there's trust. And I hope to be back when the time comes. I hope for those of you who are celebrating the holiday tomorrow, please observe responsibly and have a good fall, Thanksgiving, and the rest of it, and stay safe.
You too, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.